At least 5 lawsuits have been filed against the president's national emergency declaration. All of the arguments accuse the president of overstepping his authority by bypassing Congress and argue that an emergency doesn't exist.
An exclusive poll by Hill TV and Harris X asked how Americans feel about President Trump's decision to declare a national emergency and go ahead and build that wall along the southern border. 59% of respondents say it is an inappropriate use of emergency powers that will be struck down in the courts. 41% say the move is appropriate and will be upheld. The watchdog group Public Citizen filed one of the first lawsuits against the Trump administration on behalf of the Frontera Audubon Society and 3 landowners in Texas who were told that the government would build on their properties. Joining us to expand on the suit is Public Citizen litigation group attorney Michael Kirkpatrick. Great to have you here, Michael.
Thank you.
What is the argument that you are making in this suit?
Well, we're making several arguments. First is there is no emergency. There simply is no crisis at the border of criminals and drug traffickers and gang members coming across as described by the president in his statement. So there's a real fact issue about that, whether there even is an emergency. But probably more importantly is the legal question. The president here has made an end run around Congress. Congress has the power of the purse. Congress appropriates federal money for spending. And here Congress passed a bill appropriating what they thought was a sufficient amount of money for border security, and the president didn't like it, and so he has gone outside of our constitutional process to take money from other sources. And so there's a real constitutional problem with the president's actions.
So on the emergency declaration, or the idea of there being a crisis or not, isn't the statute that the president's referring to here, which has been around for a long time and has been used many times, 50-something I think we said, doesn't it say that the president gets to determine what the crisis is? I mean, with all due respect to your clients, I don't think the president cares what they think as to whether or not there's a crisis, and I'm not sure the law cares either. So how does that work?
Well, you're correct that the law does not define emergency. But then we have to go to what is the common interpretation of the term emergency. And this situation at the border is nothing new. In fact, immigration over the border is down. The government's own statistics show that the number of apprehensions is at a low right now. There's simply not an invasion of massive numbers of people coming across. So there's a real fact dispute there. And so we think that the word emergency has to be given its plain meaning, and this simply doesn't qualify as an emergency.
So is the idea here that, the Constitution basically says Congress has the power of the purse, right? They get to decide how the money is spent. Now, they did write this law that allows the president to declare a national emergency, did not bother to define what an emergency is, but if you allow this gaping loophole where a president can just declare an emergency whenever he or she feels like it, then you've essentially subverted the Constitution. Is that kind of the argument that's being made here?
Yes, absolutely. What you've done then is you've moved away from our separation of powers, our checks and balances, and you're giving basically unfettered discretion to the president, to the executive branch, to spend money any way he chooses. If Congress won't appropriate the money, he can declare a national emergency and do it anyway. That's just a plain violation of the whole principle of separation of powers.
Just for clarity's sake, can you tell me who were the clients you're representing and how do they have standing in this issue?
Yes, we have 3 border landowners who have been told by Customs and Border Protection that their land will be built on if appropriations are available. And so they will have the wall running across their property. And this is property which has been in their family for multiple generations. They basically live in houses that back up to the river, and Mexico is across the river. And so building the wall may in fact end up having to have their houses torn down, potentially. But even if not, they will have a giant wall just within feet of their back door and their back windows. And much of their land will be stuck on the south side of the wall while they're living on the north side of the wall. So they will lose access to their land.
Is part of the notification that the government will use eminent domain to say, we're just going to give you a check for fair market value and see you later?
Yes, that's exactly what's happened. They were sent letters asking for permission for the government to come on to survey and sample in anticipation of building the wall. They did not give permission. The government then sent another letter saying that they were preparing to sue them in federal court in South Texas in eminent domain proceedings to condemn their land and take it against their will. And again, this is land that's been in their families for many generations. Our clients grew up in these homes and have lived there all their life, and they stand to lose that. Our other client is the Frontera Audubon Society, which is a local environmental group, basically wildlife enthusiasts who enjoy watching wildlife and want to preserve habitat and preserve endangered species along the border. And what a lot of people don't understand is that area of South Texas, called the Lower Rio Grande Valley, it is one of the most biodiverse areas in all of North America. There's over 600 bird species that pass through there. There's many endangered species that cross across the river and throughout what's called the wildlife corridor, which is a whole collection of tracts of land that allow the animals to move. Well, where they want to build this wall, as one of your earlier guests said, it's not right along the river. It's somewhat in from the river on top of a levee. And what that will do is it will both cut off people from being able to go south of the wall to observe wildlife, but also it will destroy critical habitat. Because the animals need the brush in close proximity to the water. And there's only about 4 or 5% of the native habitat is left. And when we talk about building the wall, it's not just a thin wall. It's actually a 150-foot wide, what they call an enforcement zone, where they'll essentially be scraping all the vegetation away for 150-foot wide space. And so it's going to be the destruction of habitat, which is going to be very disruptive to the wildlife. And then when the river floods, which it does about every 10 years, the animals will not be able to escape across the wall to get away from the floodwaters.
Does it make a difference if it's the bollard fencing that has gone up for Tijuana, San Diego sector? When you go to the bollard fences I have, you can see there are dogs from Tijuana that go through the fence because there are slats not big enough for you, and chickens and other things make their way through, make their way back. Does that make a difference as to the calculations about migratory species? I mean, obviously birds fly over it, but for migratory species on the ground?
Yeah, 2 points. It does make a difference, except during flood conditions, often debris gets caught in those spaces between the bollards. And so it does create more of a flood risk, and it could get sort of clogged with that. The other thing is, of course, the birds can fly over the wall, but the problem really there is the destruction of the habitat,
for the
nesting area.
For the enforcement zone? Yeah.
Yes.
Mike, let me ask you, the president said a lot in his press conference, but he went sort of through his trajectory of how this would go through the courts. It'll go to the ninth, and then it'll go to the Supreme Court, and he expects...
Then it'll go back to the court, sorry.
Yeah, he expects to prevail at the Supreme Court, is essentially what he expects. And he has decent reason to expect that would be the case. For one thing, he's got his people on the court now. For another thing, court has traditionally taken an expansive view of what the executive can do. What is your expectation, or why do you believe that that may not be the case?
Yeah. I think it would be a close case at the Supreme Court, but we like our chances, mostly because when you get down to sort of first principles, that's not really a liberal or conservative sort of decision to make. It really goes back to the Constitution and this whole concept of separation of powers. So we think even some of the more conservative justices are going to be very uncomfortable with seeing the Constitution sort of distorted in a way that gives more power to the president and less to the legislature than the founding fathers intended.
All right. We will watch, and we will see. Mike Kirkpatrick, great to have you. Thank you.
Thanks for coming in.
Next on Rising, as the lawsuits pile up, as we were just discussing, arguing against the president's emergency declaration and his border wall, we are hearing from some of President Trump's supporters.
I got a conversation for you with Congressman Jim Jordan and the 57 million reasons he has for standing behind President Trump's emergency declaration. That's coming up.